Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, June 8th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, Congress makes headway on ICE and CBP funding, but not much else. Plus, there's a new temporary selection to lead U.S. intelligence, and it's a good time to look at what that job demands and how the process works. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. The House Armed Services Committee adopted an expansive right to repair amendment Thursday over the objections of the committee's chairman and several Republicans, setting up another major fight with industry over the Pentagon's access to technical data and software. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis is here with more details. Anastasia, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Terry.
The markup in the House Armed Services Committee was pretty contentious, pretty long. Where did right to repair come out in the course of the discussion?
Yeah, it was contentious and it was long, but when it came to right to repair, it was pretty bipartisan. So there was this amendment, and it was offered by Representative Maggie Goodlander, she's a Democrat, and Representative Pat Harrigan, who's a Republican. And this amendment would establish government purpose rights as the default for any technical data, software, or software documentation delivered under future DoD contracts, unless a contractor can prove and demonstrate the need for more restrictive intellectual property rights. So contractors who are seeking some of those restrictions would have to provide a lot of documentations. They would have to provide detailed list identifying each piece of data or software they believe should receive that special protection. They would also have to provide evidence that the technology was developed using private funds and not taxpayer money. And they would also need to provide clause-specific unlimited rights exclusions. And if a contractor can't do that, if they can't provide this documentation, the Pentagon would automatically receive government purpose rights. Also, the Pentagon would get government purpose rights to technical data, software, and documentation if the Defense Secretary decides and determines that a contractor improperly marked information as proprietary, or if a contractor failed to exclude unrestricted rights categories. Here is Representative Harrigan.
We have planes that cannot fly. We have ships that cannot sail. We have vehicles that cannot drive and tanks that cannot crawl. And in some of our services, that number is approaching 50% of our force. It is a genuine readiness issue. And the core of this problem is surrounding really poorly negotiated contracts from the department over many, many decades. We heard today, and what we're trying to do in this bill within the defense industrial base is recognize that it's in trouble. Give it an injection of capital because it is incapable of scale. But if we inject over $250 billion more without changing the way that we contract, we are not setting the Department of War up for success. We are not doing right by the American taxpayer.
Anastasia, there was already some right to repair language in the chairman's markup that the committee considered. How does this proposal align with what was already there?
So it's pretty limited. What Section 842 in the chairman's mark seeks to do, it would designate an intellectual property ombudsman and a mediation process to help the department resolve any disputes over intellectual rights with contractors. Those who supported the amendment, and like I said, the measure received overwhelming support, they said that section, it's just not enough. It just doesn't address the challenges that the department has been dealing with for decades. Here's Representative Sarah Jacobs.
Now, I know you're going to hear from industry. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I can out-argue a contractor's lawyer on the 5 points of intellectual property, but I don't need to, because the people who actually run this military have already told us what they need. You'll hear the department already has all the authority it needs. If that were true, the Secretary of the Army would not have sat in front of this committee and told us he cannot sign contracts to get it. You'll hear we're seizing their intellectual property. We're not. We're paying a fair price to fix equipment we already bought. The Army Secretary said it plainly. The Pentagon doesn't want to take the data, it wants to buy it. Every trade secret protection stays exactly where it is, and when the GAO went looking for a single case where the government compromised a contractor's IP, it couldn't find one. And we offered an alternative, the Ombudsman in the Chairman's Mark, Section 842. It's the version the contractors are comfortable with. It adds language that lets a company tie the department in knots by claiming almost anything that's a trade secret. That is not a right to repair. That is a loophole with a help desk.
And I also wanted to highlight Ranking Member Adam Smith's comments, because I think he said it very eloquently. He said that, look, a lot of progress has been made when it comes to intellectual property, but industry created this problem to begin with in the 2000s and 2010s by locking the Pentagon in. But he also acknowledged at the same time industry's concerns. But he said the amendment really doesn't take IP rights away from contractors. Here's Adam Smith.
We have made progress in terms of the IP problems. And part of what drives this is the bad old days, basically the first part of the 21st century, when vendor lock was everywhere. IP was a major, major problem. Industry took complete advantage of defense contractors who negotiated horrific deals and wound up locking us into things that caused massive increases in costs. And also, because there was no competition, they didn't produce it. Basically, they'd give us an inferior product, and then the only consequence was they got paid more to fix it. All right? And they took advantage of that. Industry has only themselves to blame for the fact that we're having this debate by leveraging all of that. I think it's also worth noting that IP is important, all right? And I do understand private industry, they're very twitchy about this, and for understandable reasons. That's their secret sauce. This is what they developed. If all of a sudden it goes away, they're gone. So they are always very cautious about letting it go, and they should be. And we should be cautious about that because we need industry to develop these new technologies. But this amendment does not strip IP rights. It does not do that. If it did that, I wouldn't even consider supporting it. It takes a very narrow approach, more narrow than in the past. It's prospective, doesn't get into past contracts.
This amendment passed on a voice vote, Anastasia, but not everybody's a fan. What are you hearing from folks who sit on the opposite side of the issue?
Yeah, there were some Republicans who opposed it, and also the committee's chairman, Representative Mike Rogers, opposed it. He said he basically expressed the concerns of all the industry groups, which we will talk about in a second. But he said the amendment would force companies to choose between protecting their IP and working with the Defense Department, and long-term companies would just exit and stop doing business with the Defense Department. And of course, as you would expect, industry groups have already come out with their arguments and their opposition to the amendment. For example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they issued a letter saying that they support Section 842 that requires a mediation process between the Defense Department and contractors. They say that it's a well-crafted compromise, but here's a quote from them. The Chamber believes this approach offers the best available path towards minimizing or eliminating unintended harm to the defense industrial base, but they strongly oppose to any attempt to impose a far-reaching, a more expensive right to repair framework. They say it would grant the Pentagon broad authority to access and effectively seize the manufacturer's intellectual property, trade secrets, and proprietary technical data.
This is still just the committee's version. What happens to the bill next?
Yes, of course, and the House is supposed to take up the bill by the July recess. Then we have the Senate Armed Services Committee. They will be marking up their version next week. We'll see what they come out with. But there will be many, many debates. There will be many arguments about this. And industry is going to push against these reforms. We know that last year they succeeded.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Anastasia, thanks for keeping us up to speed.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, Congress makes headway on ICE and CBP funding. but not much else. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Tune in Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. for the Innovation in Government Show, sponsored by Carasoft. Hear from the industry leaders advancing the technology shaping how agencies modernize, secure operations, and deliver better services. Innovation in Government covers what is changing now, what is working from cybersecurity and cloud to data, AI, and emerging technologies. Listen to Innovation in Government, Tuesdays at 10:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on Federal News Network. Search Innovation in Government.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. After late-night votes and a contentious markup, Congress is inching forward on some of its highest-profile priorities, including ICE and CBP funding and the annual defense authorization bill. Regular appropriations for 2027 are also moving through committees. Lauren Duggan, Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government, joins me now to walk us through where things stand. Lauren, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
It was another busy week on the Hill. Let's start with what moved forward. The Senate found its way finally to approval of funding for ICE and CBP. Tell us how that happened and what happens next.
So you're right. The Senate passed the $70-ish billion bill for ICE, CBP, and parts of the Homeland Security Department. That had been its initial goal for pretty much when they decided to break off that funding from the regular Homeland Security Appropriations Bill for 2026 and do this. It's a longer-term bill to fund the agencies for several years. But they had a lot of hurdles to get through and over, and they finally managed to do that. The biggest one this week had been the $1.8 billion weaponization fund or anti-weaponization fund that had been announced as part of a settlement, and senators looking for some sort of language around that. But in the end, they didn't attach anything to the bill, in part because of some developments around what administration officials had said over the course of the week. But that bill's over that first hurdle, and now it's over to the House to see how quickly they can be done with it as well.
And does it look like there's enough commonality to get them to move quickly?
I think so. I mean, there seemed to be pretty broad Republican support for the underlying bill in the Senate, with I think only one departing vote in the end. We'll see if they have that in the House as well. Obviously, the margin's very tight there, but they're going to try and get that through, I would say, as quickly as they can this week.
So let's go back to the Senate side, because underneath that was a lot of drama. There was a lot that was happening as folks put forward measures to try to make statements or get positions. Where did all of that settle out?
It sort of settled out with nothing being added to the bill, and it was a lot of time used to get there. I think 18 hours almost. They started around 10 a.m. and wound up around 4 in the morning, a little bit after that. But that's the challenge with reconciliation. You trade this ability to get a party line bill through easily through the Senate, but you have to go through these hoops of getting the amendments, and it has to be very narrowly tailored to the federal budget. So that's part of the drama when it comes to these reconciliation bills, these late nights and a lot of tension, with the parliamentarian being kind of raised up as a very important figure, as you have to pass muster with her rules and her interpretation of the rules when it comes to the language in the bill and the amendments as well.
Speaking of the parliamentarian, the money for the ballroom did not make it into this reconciliation, did it?
That's right. That wasn't there in the end. That was in one of the initial drafts, $1 billion for the Secret Service for the East Wing project. And they had said that wouldn't be building the ballroom part, but security around it and other improvements at the White House. But in the end, that was too difficult a thing to get through. So that was pulled out from the version that the Senate passed.
So that's one big piece of legislation that's moved forward. Another big piece on the House side is the 2027 National Defense Authorization Act. It made it through committee. That was another long day for folks. Tell us about how that vote proceeded.
Yeah, this bill would authorize $1.15 trillion, which is the discretionary part that the president had asked for and would be kind of given shape by this bill. It was, I think, 44-12 was the final vote, which is a little less bipartisan than they aimed for with this bill. But there are concerns among Democrats about the amount that's being authorized here. There were amendments to try to peel some of that back at a lower amount. But in the end, that version of the bill went through, and we'll see how quickly they can move. The Senate will join that debate debate this week as well, with the Armed Services Committee crafting its bill over the course of the week, and those will head to the two chambers, and then at some point they'll try to compromise them. One of the big things that the House did before the House panel did was to approve the name change from Department of Defense to Department of War, which is something that some people in Congress have strong feelings about. So we'll see if that survives through that process as it continues its way through Congress.
Do you read anything into the tea leaves about the less bipartisan vote count?
I mean, it may be difficult to see how that gets through. Sometimes the bills have provisions that are in the House version. Then when you meld with the Senate, they moderate out a little bit because the minority in the Senate does have a lot of sway there with the need to get to 60 votes. So we'll see how it plays out. It's early in this process. And then there's also the separate appropriations process for defense that hasn't really gotten underway yet, although we'll probably see subcommittee action this week in the House, at least on the actual appropriations, in addition to this authorization bill.
Lauren Duggan is the Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, I want to pull you in a slightly different direction. There's a common leadership adage that personnel is policy. And there were a couple of personnel announcements last week that some people think got in the way of the administration's policy. One was Bill Pulte to be the acting DNI. They were very clear that that's just an acting appointment. And also the president expressed his intent to nominate Todd Blanche as Attorney General. At the same time as the FISA bill is sitting on everybody's desks trying to find a way out, and the anti-weaponization fund was front and center of conversation. How do you see those all playing together?
Pulte, I think, definitely played into some things that we saw last week. There was an amendment to the reconciliation bill saying that you had to have the right qualifications for the job and try to ban funding. That amendment wasn't adopted either, but it was a part of the debate, and people had to navigate that question. There was a procedural vote right after reconciliation wrapped up to try to get on to the House-passed FISA reauthorization, and that fell short. They didn't get the 50 votes they needed to get onto that, so that was a hiccup in their plans to try and take care of FISA before it expires on June 12th. Now there's options. They could try again when they get back. They could look at another extension. We'll see if they need that. But that certainly played in there. And then with Todd Blanche, who's the acting attorney general, who was once the president's personal attorney and was part of this negotiation that led to the fund, he did say it before Congress last week he wouldn't pursue it while the legal case was there. And I think that helped move some of the discussion forward and get the bill over the line without language being attached. But you're right. I mean, personnel is a big deal, and who's in charge of these agencies matters to senators. They may never get a chance to weigh in on Pulte, but if the Blanche nomination is to go through, it has to get through committee and through the Senate. So we'll be watching very closely in the coming weeks to see what the reaction is to that.
And those are both critical issues for the administration, so they've really sort of slowed the roll there, along with other things that are starting to sort of pile up. So let's talk about regular appropriations bills. How are we making progress there?
The House has made a good amount of progress. They've gotten 2 through the full House. They've gotten a lot more through subcommittee and full committee, and they are, if they stick to their schedule, on track to be done with all of them by the end of the month, at least through committee, which gives them a marker going forward. Now, the Senate has had a slower start. They were supposed to meet Thursday to do 3 bills. They postponed that in part because of the reconciliation debate. But Chairwoman Susan Collins told our reporter last week that if she could, she'd like to do 6 bills this coming Thursday through committee. Half the work could be done in one markup. I assume that would be a pretty long day if they were to try and get all 6 of those through, but that would be progress. So we're seeing some action toward that because September 30th isn't that far away, especially with the August recess and all the other things they need to do. But I think these are more markers for future talks than necessarily the answer to keeping the government open after September 30th. But we'll see.
Does that tempo now of progress surprise you, considering where we were earlier in the year?
A little bit. I mean, getting the bills through committee is easier. Getting, say, the agriculture bill across the floor last week took some arm twisting, and it was a close vote that didn't look like it might make it, although it did in the end. So it's going to be a tough process on this. It's, again, very narrow margins and very big decisions to make about where you want to make cuts and whether you want to boost defense as high as the administration wants to take it.
So in the midst of all of those normal appropriations conversations, the House is rolling towards Reconciliation 3.0.
That has been the talk. That's going to be a heavy lift. And if they want to do that, there are the procedural advantages and disadvantages we talked about. But there is still interest in doing the $350 billion for defense that was separate from what, for example, the authorization committee weighed, and what to do maybe around the affordability agenda or lowering prices. There's interest in passing anti-fraud pieces of legislation that would have a budgetary nexus. So there is interest in doing this, but that means one or two more vote-a-ramas in the Senate and trying to get all this done while chipping away at the other work. So it would be a tall order, but there remains interest and talk about doing that. So can't dismiss it.
And as we've talked about, there are a limited number of work days between now and the election.
Very few days, and the clock is ticking on them very quickly.
Lauren Duggan is Deputy News Director for Bloomberg Government. Lauren, thanks as always.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, a proposed NDA for federal employees is drawing attention to how information moves inside government and who feels safe sharing it. But first, there's a new temporary selection to lead U.S. intelligence, and it's a good moment to look at what that job demands and how the process works. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The appointment of an acting DNI brings up bigger questions about how the intelligence community is led and coordinated. That includes what kind of experience that role demands and how long an acting structure can hold. Here with insight on what has to go right now is former FBI special agent and national security expert Rich Kolko. Rich, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry. Glad to be here.
President Trump has tapped Bill Pulte, who currently leads the Federal Housing Finance Agency, to replace Tulsi Gabbard in an acting role as the Director of National Intelligence. Before we dip into how that process might work, would you just remind us and our listeners what the DNI actually is responsible for on a day-to-day basis?
Well, the DNI does several big things, but the biggest they do are policy and oversight of the 18 intelligence community agencies. And of course, they prepare and deliver the president's daily brief. This is the threat brief that covers a variety of areas, and they go to the White House and provide that brief to the president of the United States.
And by law, this position is supposed to be filled by someone with deep national security experience. What sorts of background would you say typically matter most for a person filling this position?
Well, if you look back through previous directors of national intelligence, they were senior officials and had worked their way up in various agencies of the intelligence community. Several of them were military, CIA. They had that background. They did operations at the entry level, worked their way up to senior executive service, and then were appointed DNI. So they typically had a career full of experience understanding operations, understanding briefings, understanding budgets, writing reports, and all the things that make an intelligence officer an intelligence officer.
And the 18 agencies that they supervise cross a variety of federal departments, correct?
Yeah, military, National Security Agency, FBI, Department of Energy, even the Drug Enforcement Administration is part of it. Some of the ones people aren't as familiar with, the National Reconnaissance Office. Those are the folks who put all the satellites into orbit for national security means. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They look at that satellite imagery. They provide a lot of the graphics and maps used by the military and others. Of course, the NSA, who does the collection overseas. We've got the CIA, number one, and the DIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is kind of a partner to the CIA, but more on the military side.
So that's a pretty complex structure, pretty challenging diplomacy, if you will, to manage all of those different directorates, all of whom have pretty senior political appointees as well. How does the DNI integrate all of the intel from those agencies into a coherent daily picture?
Well, that's a key word there. You said integrate. So you've got these different agencies that are providing their intelligence and information that they've worked up, analyzed, assessed, and provide that up through the chain, ends up with the DNI. So they've got sort of competing interests. And part of what the DNI has to do is determine which ones of those briefs are most important, has to put them in order, has to assess them, determine which ones I want to go forward with, and end up in that presidential daily brief for what could be various action or activity conducted by various U.S. government agencies, including, as we see now, the military conducting operations in the Iran theater.
So let's circle back then to Mr. Pulte's acting position. The president was very clear it would be an acting appointment. Walk us through how that changes things, both in terms of the authority that this individual will hold while acting in that position, the role of the Senate. How does it all play out?
Well, in the acting role, I believe they can serve for up to a year without going through Senate confirmation. Certainly, this is a tricky time right now with the midterms just a few months away. Getting a confirmation through right now could be difficult. It turns out the president has said that Mr. Pulte will also hold on to his current job, in essence, making DNI, and I hate to say this, but a part-time role, which just seems very difficult right now with the war, with all the ongoing negotiations. Certainly the information that our negotiators take to the negotiating table works its way through the intelligence community, and that means through DNI. So that needs full attention. But if you look through the page of biographies on DNI's website right now, the deputies that are in there are a very group of seasoned, experienced intelligence officers. So if Mr. Pulte is able to utilize and rely on those personnel to help guide him as he has to make some very important decisions, not only in the future, but immediately, then I think that'll go a long way. If he chooses to do it in his own way without utilizing the expertise offered to him now, it'll make the job certainly more complex.
Rich Kolko is a retired U.S. Navy commander, Navy pilot, and retired FBI special agent. Rich, you just mentioned the DNI being a part-time role. Clearly, we are in current operations. There's a lot of intel going back and forth. What matters most for him in this leadership role? He's trying to hold down the Federal Housing and Finance Agency and DNI. What does he need to prioritize in the DNI role?
Well, he's got the policy and oversight, and that includes budget matters for the intelligence community. I think about $80 billion a year. So he's got to help divvy up that money among the intelligence agencies who are all, fighting for their share of the pie. And that's a part of, what the DNI has to do. I think right now, operationally, obviously, he has to prepare the negotiators who are working on the Iran issue with the best, most current intelligence available and accurate intelligence. And he has to provide this to the president so the president can guide his negotiators on what they can and can't do. We see Iran reconstituting some of their capabilities. That has to be accurately displayed for the negotiators. And of course, we've got the ongoing war in Ukraine, which just won't seem to go away and always threatens to spread into neighboring countries, which are NATO members. Also problematic. We've actually seen a rise in that theater as well over just the last couple of weeks. So DNI has to be aware of that. And there's always the concern that China will make a move on Taiwan while we're so busy with other areas of the world. So the DNI has a full plate, has to prepare these presidential daily briefs, cyber threats, terrorist threats, war threats, a variety of things. President Trump has taken less of these briefs than previous presidents. Don't forget, DNI is a relatively new agency, just formed after 9/11. But presidents going backwards, Biden, Obama, and Bush had that presidential daily brief on a more regular basis than President Trump, who chooses to get his intelligence through different venues or avenues.
In your prior life, you've been a practitioner in the intelligence community. How important would you say it is, the climate and the priorities that are set from the top?
Critical. You don't want people running rampant or rogue. We've got to have a unified direction that we're going. While the DNI wants competing analysis on some of the same problems or some of the same issues, that helps them make decisions. When you get two different agencies looking at one problem, they may come back with a different analysis of that issue. And then the DNI has to decide, which one they want to use or go forward with or help order additional analysis so that it resolves itself and they have an accurate picture. So I think those are all things that DNI has to work on. And at this point, certainly working in I guess I'll say it again, a part-time status right now, he's going to have to rely heavily on his deputies. And again, those deputies look very, very qualified. So if he does that, I think we're in good shape. If they go a different route, it'll make it much more challenging.
There's been periodic discussion, maybe even more so over the last 18 months, about whether the DNI structure still adds value, whether it is still able to solve the problem that it was created for post 9/11. From your perspective, is it still working? Is this a way to maybe phase out the DNI and say, we really don't need it much anymore?
That's a great question. When DNI was originally formed in the post 9/11 days, it was meant to be a very, very small agency with just, I think, literally 100 or 200 people, not doing daily analysis, but just relying on the analysis of the various intelligence community agencies. They've grown to nearly 2,000 people. So there's some duplication of effort now being done at DNI as well as some of the intelligence community agencies. And I know that DNIs have looked for ways to reduce that. They want to kind of get back to what it was originally designed to do. And I guess potentially we could head that direction. That's certainly a decision of the president and Congress together. But again, these decisions are difficult to make right now while we're in the middle of military operations. So that there's a time and a place for that. This just might not be the time and the place.
And as this process moves forward, assuming Mr. Pulte actually takes on the role and the responsibilities, what will you be watching for to know whether or not this current acting responsibility is being well cared for?
Well, I think hopefully getting some resolution in the Iran operations. We've heard that the negotiations, they've come close several times, but nothing has been signed or approved. And this is an ongoing issue in this Strait of Hormuz, the nuclear issue. The president and the negotiators he sends to the table have to have the most accurate information, have to be able to provide the necessary intelligence so that something can get signed, because clearly we don't want that to continue ongoing. And certainly in the Strait of Hormuz, there's going to be just a major effect on the world economy. It needs to be resolved. And the president's made it clear Iran's not going to have a nuclear weapon. So they've got to get the intelligence necessary for the president and the president's negotiators to be able to sit at that table and get that done.
Rich Kolko is a retired U.S. Navy commander, Navy pilot, and retired FBI special agent. Mr. Kolko, thanks so much for jumping in with me this morning.
Thanks for having me on, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, a proposed non-disclosure agreement for federal employees is drawing attention to how information moves inside government and who feels safe sharing it. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. A proposal to create a government-wide non-disclosure agreement for federal employees is raising new questions about transparency and accountability. The administration says it reinforces existing rules, but critics warn it could have a broader impact on how employees communicate and report concerns. That tension between policy and behavior is at the center of the debate. Joe Spielberger of the Project on Government Oversight joins me now to break down the possible outcomes. Joe, thanks for joining me. It's lovely to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Terry. It's great to be back here.
When you were last with us back in April or so, we were talking about a completely different policy, but you warned us then that policies don't have to change the law to change behavior, that the real impact can be just the chilling effect on federal employees. When you look at this new proposed government-wide non-disclosure agreement, are you seeing that same kind of maybe thought process playing out here?
Absolutely. So if this proposed NDA does go into effect, the likely impact we'll see is a widespread crackdown on whistleblowing and free speech rights. So to be clear, the NDA does adhere to the requirement that it states it doesn't conflict with or supersede whistleblower protections. That's language that's legally required for these sorts of NDAs. And at the same time, even if whistleblower protections will technically still exist on paper, this will have a direct chilling effect. So one thing that this proposal does, it's aimed directly at insider sources who have disclosed information that the media then reports on. OPM justifies this by citing examples from the raid on Venezuela to ICE activity to the Dobbs decision. and some of the most polarizing and controversial recent decisions and actions. So that makes this seem more designed to protect against potentially politically damaging information from getting out, rather than information we truly want to keep confidential, and to further shield the administration from more transparency and oversight.
But Joe, put this in context for us, because, federal employees already operate under some restrictions in terms of what they can say and who they can say it to. Is this just reiterating those, or is this putting new constraints on them?
So you're right. It's certainly not unusual to restrict certain information from being disclosed without authorization. Obviously, we already have laws in place preventing the release of classified information and other information that we truly want to keep private. So things like medical records, taxpayer information, social security numbers, and other types of sensitive personal information. So on the one hand, the administration even is saying that this proposal doesn't create new substantive restrictions and is simply codifying what already exists under the law. So even if we take that at face value, that would seemingly make this unnecessary to begin with. However, this proposed NDA creates this expansive category of so-called confidential government information that they are defining to include all non-public and confidential information they say should not be disclosed. And so that risks sweeping up a large amount of ordinary government work, even if that could be evidence of abuse of power, violations of the law or the Constitution, or other types of wrongdoing. And so NDAs in and of themselves are not unprecedented, but what is unprecedented is this wide-scale blanket NDA across the federal government.
Are the provisions in this NDA sufficient to eliminate confusion on the part of federal employees in terms of what they can and can't say, or are they more likely to err on the side of caution and just go, forget it, I'm not going to talk about anything?
That's really what gets to the heart of this issue, where even if this final NDA, if it is enacted, includes that legally required language stating that it doesn't conflict with whistleblower protections, on its face, having this very vague, loosely defined, and expansive category will completely risk increasing confusion and fear among would-be whistleblowers, where they will not have any sense of what information they can and cannot disclose.
Joe Spielberger is the Senior Policy Counsel at the Project on Government Oversight. Joe, you've mentioned the whistleblower protection a couple times, so I want to come back to it and dig in a little bit more. As you say, the proposal explicitly says it does not override whistleblower protections. But how's that going to play out in real life? If a federal employee says, wow, I have seen something really bad here and I need to file a report, I need to let someone know, how are they going to navigate this space between whistleblower protections and the NDA?
So it is already exceedingly difficult to be navigating in this current political environment how people can safely blow the whistle through lawful whistleblower channels. And one of the biggest concerns is that this NDA is not being proposed in a vacuum. But one thing it does is it explicitly links this NDA to suitability and fitness determinations, which this administration is already changing to make it easier to fire people. So in practice, it's likely that refusing to sign to or adhere to this NDA may be grounds for termination, because separate to this NDA proposal, a related proposal would remove many suitability appeals from the Merit Systems Protection Board and into an internal OPM review process. So that would allow OPM to be able to say that employees aren't complying with this NDA and are therefore unsuited for federal government, and they could direct agencies to fire them with very little recourse to appeal.
Okay, I do want to be clear. This is still a proposed rule. It's not implemented. It's still open for comment. But you just said something that's quite disturbing. If this rule goes into practice as it's currently written, What option would a federal employee have if they really feel uncomfortable about signing this? Is it sign or get fired?
So if you're a federal employee, what I would advise is to speak to an attorney and or a union representation who can really explain what this means in terms of current rights that exist and can advise you accordingly. What I can say is that, we certainly hope that this proposal will not go into fruition. If it does, it is very likely to be litigated, and whether it survives in how it's currently written or how it might be changed will likely depend on whether the government can issue this very broad restriction against disclosing unclassified information, and to what extent that restricts or prohibits employees from providing information to Congress and lawfully blowing the whistle.
Joe, you watch this space very closely, I know. How does this fit into many of the other moves you've seen the administration make when it comes to managing federal personnel?
I think the bottom line is that this administration has worked over the past several months to really exert as much control over the day-to-day management and operations of the executive branch as possible. They've worked to instill loyalty requirements. They've worked to undermine people's rights and protections to prevent them from speaking out against abuse of power and corruption. And the bottom line in all of this is that, we understand the importance of a nonpartisan civil service and open and transparent and accountable government. We learn so much information about corruption and abuse of power, thanks in large part to whistleblowers. And at a time when people already have very low levels of trust in government, OPM seemingly is turning those principles of good governance upside down to essentially say that the problem of distrust comes from information getting out rather than the actions and decisions and misconduct being exposed. So I think regardless of political leanings, this is an issue that should concern anyone.
And do you think that this will ultimately change what information reaches the public?
Absolutely. Again, whistleblowers already take huge risks to themselves and their careers to speak out and to do the right thing. It is already exceedingly difficult to do so. And when agencies are working so hard to make it even more difficult for people to safely speak out and to really control the flow of information, that will prevent necessary information from getting to Congress, getting to the media, getting to government watchdogs, and getting to the public so that we can have a better understanding of where corruption manifests and how it can most effectively be addressed. And again, I think the bottom line is that being able to speak out against corruption and abuse of power wherever it exists should be a concern that unites us all, because it's foundational to our democracy and our ability to self-govern.
Joe Spielberger is the Senior Policy Counsel at the Project on Government Oversight. Joe, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Lieutenant General Paul Stanton is redefining the concept of teamwork at the Defense Information Systems Agency. The director of DISA says the interdependency of technology systems and the speed of artificial intelligence are driving this change. With more on what DISA's new approach to teamwork is going to look like, Federal News Network's executive editor Jason Miller joins me now. Jason, thanks for being here.
It was a pleasure, Terry.
So when General Stanton talks about teamwork, who's he talking about and what does he want to be different?
Stanton says because of the DoD Information Network, commonly known as the DoDIN, it's a complex infrastructure, right? It includes all these different pieces and parts: transport, host, compute, cloud-based capabilities, public key infrastructure, identity control and access management solutions, cybersecurity at large. It's not just what he calls a one-person game. So DoD, DISA, its vendors, they are critical to DoDIN's success. And Stanton, who spoke earlier last week at the AFCEA TechNet Cyber Conference, says when DoD considers the speed, the scope, the scale of current and future operations, that idea of teamwork becomes so much more important.
How do we work better with each other? How do we directly communicate within the bounds of a left and right limit to meet the requirements of the changing operating environment? Where are there dependencies? Upon which other systems is your solution dependent? From where do you derive your data? To whom are you offering data? From where are you getting your configuration? Answer all of the questions. Develop an understanding of the dependencies. Know your role. Know where your system fits. And then work as a team to drive towards synergistic effects.
Terry, there's a lot of questions he's posing for both DISA and its vendors, and they really need to answer them as part of this approach. And that's why he says it's a different type of teamwork. In fact, Stanton says all of his priorities, readiness, campaigning, continuous modernization, lethality, are all helping drive this culture change of what teamwork really does mean.
If you are part of the DOIN, if you are contracted in support of DISA or DCDC, you're on the team. And you must be trained and ready. And you must understand how your individual responsibilities fit into the collective. That's what we mean when we reference readiness. Readiness helps us drive mission effectiveness. Brilliant at the basics, yes. Operationally relevant and effective is a must. It also helps us drive accountability. The days of letting your certificate expire and breaking the DOIN are over. Period. If you make a configuration change on the firewall and you put an any rule in and you cause a flood of traffic, not good enough. The stakes are too high. We cannot take down our operating environment when we're in full-scale combat operations. Can't do it. But I can't drive accountability until I have established readiness, until I know that you're trained and ready, you understand your individual tasks. Once I've done that, we're good at it, we're operationally effective, and if we break it, there's accountability. There's a method to the madness.
Stanton says the team must drive toward the same outcomes versus just delivering a capability without understanding that bigger picture.
So Jason, how would that be different from how teamwork is defined at DISA today?
Today, Stanton says teamwork is very transactional. It's almost one way, DISA to industry.
We write contracts, we develop task orders, we ask you to do something, you do it. If something breaks, we call you and ask you to fix it. Or you detect it, you fix it, and you call us. Pretty much how it works. Not good enough. It's not good enough to meet the speed, scope, and scale challenges of today and into the future.
He points to the combatant commands. DISA works very closely with 11 combatant commands, and he says basically we're just not as effective as we could be or should be. You know, in those 11 different combatant commands, there's 11 different implementations or instantiations of a solution. Stan says that doesn't work well in a global fight. A vendor can make a change, add an innovation to their product, and the vendor and DISA, they have to understand how that affects that software, the system, but there's also what he says second and third order effects of that system, and that all connects to each other. And today they don't understand what a lot of those second and third order effects are, and they have to understand it, and that's why this idea of teamwork is changing.
Sounds to me like the practices they have in place are pretty well ingrained, though. So how does General Stanton expect to change the culture of both DISA and the industry?
There's probably a lot of eye rolls, a lot of sighs at FCA TechNet Cyber when he said this. I mean, Terry, listen, you and I have been around long enough. Teamwork. We gotta be better partners, right? That's a platitude that we hear time and again. It's a tired talk track. And in fact, I asked General Stanton that same question during a meeting with reporters after his speech. And he says, listen, it all really does come back to this readiness priority.
Establishing and holding accountability has a dependency on preparation, training, and development. I have to make it clear what my expectations are. I have to provide an environment that supports training and validation and qualification before I can hold you accountable. Well, let's be clear. Once the standard is now established, the training environment is rapidly in development. Qualification is part of the readiness and the training. If you then make the mistake absolute repercussions. And those repercussions will be based on a individual industry relationship.
He says DISA will have to add clauses to contracts to help further drive home these changes. And again, this culture change, Terry, as we know, will not happen overnight. It's going to require, as he says, relationships, team building, development, again, new contract language. But he also says without this shift, DISA and DoD are not going to be able to operate at the speed, scope, and scale that's necessary these days. So, of course, this has to bleed down into the DISA workforce, and that means the culture change also means changing that workforce.
We have a leader development program that we're instituting within both DISA and DCDC. If I could strike the term supervisor from the vernacular, I would. I don't want a supervisor. I need leaders. But I can't expect just because you have been a member of the agency for a number of years and have demonstrated your competency and gotten a promotion into a position that now has, put in air quotes, a supervisory responsibility, that we have developed you as a leader. We have to do the leader development. Once we've done the leader development, now my team that I am leading is contractors, it's civilians, it's military service members.
This culture shift will take time. Most folks will not see a difference for months, probably. But Stanton says, given how AI is changing the way DoD fights, it's going to require DISA to think a bit differently, to interoperate a bit differently, and for the military and really to talk about doctrine, organizational training differently.
Jason, one of the challenges that key leaders like General Stanton face is they don't have a long runway. You know, organizational change takes time, and we change leaders out pretty quickly. Did he talk about how long he thinks it's going to take?
He didn't, but what I did, that I had that same thought. I was like, well, how long has he been in that role? Because usually DISA leaders, they have a shelf life, for lack of a better word. A lot of leaders in the military stay in a position for so many months or so many years and then move on. So he joined, I think he became director of DISA back in 2024. So he's entering his second year. He's in the middle of his second year. So there is a short amount of time. And I think that's why the message he is sending to industry to say, hey, change is coming, and we want you to be prepared for this change and start acting like that change is here. To your point, Terry, this is not something that's he's going to flip a switch and make it happen. But I think by messaging certain ways to industry, especially at a conference like FCA, TechNet, Cyber, it's really driving this message that he wants this to happen faster and better.
That's Federal News Network's executive editor, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for this story.
Always a pleasure, Terry.
You can find all the details at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. Are you shaping cloud policy, leading IT modernization efforts, or trying to deliver secure, reliable services? Join Federal News Network's virtual cloud exchange June 10th and 11th for timely insights into how agencies are moving from cloud adoption to cloud optimization. Register today at federalnewsnetwork.com. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.